Picture this. It's the 26th of December, 1900. The wind is just howling, whipping icy sea spray across the deck of a supply ship as it slowly creeps toward a tiny, isolated lighthouse in the freezing expanse of the North Atlantic. Now, this isn't just a tough journey. It's a desperate one. They've just been through weeks of some of the most punishing winter storms in recorded history. But as the ship finally draws near this remote outpost, it becomes obvious that something is terribly, deeply wrong. The sky is gray and heavy, yet there's no flag flying at the landing to signal that all is well. The bitter cold is literally biting to the bone, but there's absolutely zero smoke rising from the chimney. The ship's crew sounds the horn. They fire off a distress flare into the dim sky. They blast the steam whistle again and again, the sound echoing across the freezing, violent water. And the response? Nothing. Just complete and utter silence. So what could make three experienced men just vanish from a rock in the middle of the ocean? Because when a relief keeper finally managed to scramble ashore through the crashing waves and stepped inside that lighthouse, he found the place completely empty. Three grown men, seasoned veterans of the sea, had just vanished with absolutely nowhere else to go. No lifeboats were missing, and the freezing Atlantic stretched for miles in every direction. The crazy part? Not a single body was ever recovered. Not one definitive, indisputable clue was left behind to explain where they went or why they would ever leave the safety of that tower. It's a historical cold case that has baffled investigators, historians, and sailors for well over a century. So, what actually happened on that jagged rock in the dark days just before Christmas?
Okay, let's dive into this because the details of what that relief keeper, Joseph Moore, actually found inside the lighthouse are incredibly chilling. The interior was perfectly frozen in time, almost like a photograph of a life abruptly interrupted. Walking into the living quarters, he found the beds completely unmade, like the guys had just gotten up. The heavy kitchen clock, which was normally wound with meticulous care, had completely stopped, just ticked down to a silent halt. There was a meal left half-eaten on the table, cold and abandoned. And perhaps the most unsettling detail of all, a heavy chair was knocked over on the floor. It really paints a picture of someone jumping up in an absolute, sudden panic and rushing out without even looking back. The only living creature left in the entire towering 75-foot structure was a single canary sitting entirely alone in its cage, surrounded by total silence.
Now, to really understand how this could happen, we have to talk about where we are. The Flannan Isles, or the Seven Hunters as locals have called them for generations, are a scattering of incredibly remote, jagged, storm-battered rocks sitting about 20 miles west of Scotland's Isle of Lewis. These islands are profoundly exposed to the full, unbroken fury of the Atlantic Ocean. Honestly, they are so unforgiving that for centuries, seasoned fishermen flat out refused to spend even a single night there, mostly because of deeply ingrained old superstitions about spirits haunting the rocks. But, in 1899, humanity decided to try and conquer nature anyway. The Northern Lighthouse Board constructed this massive, 23-meter-tall lighthouse right on the highest point of the largest island, Elian Moor. It was a true feat of engineering, designed by David Allen Stevenson. And actually, fun fact, he hailed from the exact same family as the famous adventure novelist Robert Louis Stevenson. Let's look at the men who manned this incredibly remote post. There were always 3 keepers stationed on the island at any given time, with a 4th resting back on the mainland. In December 1900, the crew was led by James Ducat, the principal keeper and a highly respected 20-year veteran of the lighthouse service. Then you had Thomas Marshall, serving as the 2nd assistant, and finally, Donald MacArthur. Now, MacArthur was actually an occasional keeper. He was a local guy just filling in because the regular assistant, William Ross, had fallen ill and had to stay ashore. It's just a cruel twist of fate that made Ross the only survivor of this 4-man rotation. The lives of these 3 men on Eileen Moor were filled with highly regimented, physically exhausting daily chores. We're talking hauling heavy brass canisters of paraffin oil up dozens of steep, winding stairs, meticulously polishing the massive glass prisms of the lens, trimming wicks, and keeping detailed weather records. It was a lonely, repetitive life, governed entirely by the clock and the weather. A totally ordinary routine until it wasn't. Let's walk through the critical timeline here to see exactly how this tragedy unfolded. On the morning of Saturday, December 15th, James Ducat makes the final normal log entry, and it noted absolutely nothing unusual. Just that the day's standard duties, like cleaning the immense lens and filling the heavy oil canteens, were finished before 9 o'clock. But that very same night, a passing steamship called the Archtor noticed something super alarming. Looking toward the islands, the crew realized the lighthouse was completely dark. A beacon designed to be seen for 24 miles was just out. Unfortunately, because that steamship ran into its own mechanical troubles and rough seas, reporting the outage got significantly delayed. Meanwhile, severe, violent winter storms trapped the dedicated lighthouse supply ship, the Hesperus, in port on the mainland. It simply couldn't brave the swells to reach the island. This meant that this massive lighthouse sat in terrifying, unattended darkness for 11 straight days. 11 days before Captain Jim Harvey could finally anchor near the island to investigate on December 26th. When the superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, Robert Muirhead, arrived a few days later to conduct an official investigation, he went straight to the island's exposed west landing, and man, the destruction he found there was absolutely staggering. Just think about the sheer scale of the violence for a second. 110 feet above sea level, an immensely heavy wooden storage box used for holding supplies was completely torn right out of its deep rock crevice. Thick iron railings, bolted deeply into the stone, were wrenched clean out of their concrete foundations and mangled. A massive boulder, weighing over a ton, that's roughly the weight of a small car, had actually been shifted entirely out of its place by the sheer force of water. And incredibly, even 200 feet up on the clifftop, the tough matted grass turf was torn away a full 30 feet back from the cliff's edge. But amidst all this massive, chaotic destruction, Muir had found something really perplexing. Every single landing and mooring rope recovered was still perfectly neatly coiled on its peg. It's a stark juxtaposition, right? The unimaginable chaotic power of nature set right against the methodical, unpanicked habits of careful men who were likely caught by total, instantaneous surprise. Now, what's really interesting about this case, and probably the most chilling clue into those final moments, actually comes from the clothing left behind inside the lighthouse. When Superintendent Muirhead searched the living quarters, he discovered that Ducat and Marshall had gone outside wearing their heavy sea boots and proper foul weather coats. Their gear was missing from the pegs. But Donald MacArthur's heavy weatherproof coat was found still hanging right there on the wall. He had apparently rushed out into a freezing, roaring North Atlantic storm in nothing but his indoor shirt sleeves. This missing coat strongly suggests a sudden, frantic rush outside. I mean, it paints a pretty vivid, terrifying picture. You can almost see a man who suddenly realized something was terribly wrong, maybe seeing a danger approaching his friends, and didn't even have the crucial seconds to spare to grab his jacket before bursting out the door into the freezing gale. Now, if you've spent any time on the internet looking into this case, you've probably heard a very different version of events. You know the ones: wild tales of alien abductions, giant sea monsters pulling men from the cliffs, or dramatic final log entries where these hardened sailors are suddenly weeping, praying, and writing ominous phrases like, "God is over all." Well, historians like Mike Dash have dug deep into the primary archives, and let me tell you, he completely debunked all of that. Those highly dramatic, emotional log entries, they're entirely fake, literally fabricated by sensationalist writers decades after the fact just to sell magazines. When you look at the genuine surviving log written by James Ducat, it shows absolutely nothing but normal winter weather, standard maintenance duties, and no mention of fear, illness, or impending doom whatsoever. The true mystery needs no embellishment. So, stripping away the ghosts and the myths leaves us with Superintendent Muirhead's measured, evidence-based conclusion. After carefully analyzing the massive physical destruction at the West Landing, Muirhead concluded that Ducat and Marshall had gone down to secure their equipment during an incoming gale. While they were working, an unusually massive wave, what we now call a rogue wave, swept straight up the steep rock face, cresting well over 100 feet high, and just carried the men into the sea in an instant. There were no sea serpents involved, there were no extraterrestrials beaming them up, just the terrifying, overwhelming power of the ocean. But even with a logical, scientifically sound theory in place, the exact sequence of events that day remains entirely unresolved. Did all three men go down to the precarious landing together, completely breaking the strict rule that one man must always stay in the light room? Or did Ducat and Marshall go down first to secure the ropes, and MacArthur, looking down from the cliff and seeing that giant, anomalous wave approaching, knocked over his chair and rushed out in his shirt sleeves to desperately warn them, only to be swept away himself? We're never truly going to know, and this sudden tragedy left a deeply complicated legacy for the families left behind. While the families of James Ducat and Donald MacArthur were eventually granted pensions by the Lighthouse Board to support their widows and children, sadly, Thomas Marshall's father had his financial claim completely denied. It left a really bitter stain in the wake of an already devastating loss. Back in 1912, a poet named Wilfred Wilson Gibson wrote a pretty famous atmospheric poem about the Flannan Isles that heavily popularized those supernatural myths we just talked about, basically painting the men as victims of some dark curse. But modern history has tried very hard to ground this story back in respectful reality. In 2018, a beautiful memorial was unveiled in the village of Brascleet over on the Isle of Lewis. It depicts a heavy bronze wave sweeping menacingly over a sturdy sandstone lighthouse, with a solitary figure standing resolute. And incredibly, this poignant monument was actually unveiled by a direct descendant of Donald MacArthur himself. Looking at the sweeping lines of the bronze and the unmoving stone, it's a somber reminder that these men weren't characters in a cheap ghost story. They were three ordinary, hardworking guys who died doing a lonely, incredibly essential job to keep other sailors safe in the dark.
And I think this brilliantly illustrates a deeply fascinating point about human nature, as the source material for this explainer notes so perfectly how easily the quiet, human truth of a tragedy gets dressed up over time with invented drama. We seem to have this deep-seated psychological need to invent ghosts, mythical sea monsters, and dramatic crying logs, rather than just accept the terrifying random reality of the natural world. In a weird way, it's almost comforting to believe in a targeted curse, because the alternative, that three highly experienced, careful men could simply be wiped off the face of the earth in a single silent second by a freak accident of nature, reminds us just how fragile we really are. Sometimes the raw truth is just too stark and too indifferent for us to accept on its own.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to turn it over to you. Based on the neatly coiled ropes, the missing coat left hanging in the hall, and the sheer, unfathomable destruction of the West Landing, what do you think really happened on that clifftop in December of 1900? Did MacArthur rush out in a doomed attempt to save his friends from the incoming swell? Or is there another piece to this puzzle that the ocean swallowed up forever? Share your theories in the comments below. And hey, if you found this analysis fascinating, make sure to stick around, because in our next explainer, we're going to be tackling another historical cold case where an entire settlement vanished just as suddenly and just as completely. You definitely won't want to miss it.